Hello, and thank you, Maud, for that introduction. The oral tradition of Swahili vitendawili has been long celebrated for its literary richness. Little work, however, has been done to place this verbal art as part of a larger, most probably continent-wide tradition of riddles and riddling. Using ongoing work from Mitchell et al. Forthcoming as a theoretical basis, this talk compares Swahili vitendawili with riddles and riddling traditions from language communities of central Tanzania's rift, including the Southern Cushitic language Gorwaa and the Bantu language Ihanzu. In addition to providing some basic demonstration of the ways in which riddles may be compared across different traditions, this talk contextualizes Swahili riddles as one instantiation of a diverse and widespread genre. Very briefly, my name is Andrew Harvey, and I'm a junior professor here at the University of Bayreuth. I'm a trained linguist interested in the languages of the Tanzanian Rift, their documentation and description, their morphosyntax, as well as the histories and cultures of their speaker communities, especially as evinced through language contact and verbal arts. I work particularly closely with three language communities. I began working with speakers of Gorwaa in 2012. I began working with speakers of Ihanzu in 2018, and I began working with speakers of Hadza in 2019. All of these collaborations continue to date. Today, I'll be drawing on riddling data from the Gorwaa and Ihanzu communities, and the only reason I will not draw on Hadza is that the Hadza community does not seem to have a riddling tradition. If you're interested in my thoughts on why this may be so, perhaps we can discuss it in the questions at the end. Additionally, this talk will be made available online shortly after its live presentation via the DOI on screen. From this point on, the talk will have three major parts. I'll start with a word on the data I make use of in this talk. I'll then compare the Swahili riddling tradition with those from the Gorwaa and Ihanzu communities. I'll then conclude with some thoughts on the vitality of these traditions. Regarding the data, today I am drawing on the riddles from a handful of sources. First, each of the languages of our sample has at least some published material on riddles. For Gorwaa, this is part of a larger treatment by Heepe in 1930, and for Ihanzu, this is from a master's dissertation completed in 2015. The Swahili riddles I'll be using today come from an unpublished manuscript shared to myself and my colleagues. For Gorwaa and Ihanzu, I will also be employing materials which come from original research. In both of these cases, series of field recordings from either naturalistic sessions of riddling, such as the one you see in the image here, as well as more interview-style recordings where riddling occurs in a one-on-one context between two native speakers. In both cases, this data was first transcribed from the recordings into the local languages and then translated from the local languages into Swahili by trained local researchers. This material was then used as a basis for morphological parsing and glossing, as well as providing an English translation, and these steps were completed by myself. Having given some details on the data, we can now move on to the comparison. First, the areas of comparison are both located in East Africa. The Swahili lingua culture, which will not be a surprise for this particular audience, traditionally located along the Indian Ocean coasts of modern-day Kenya and Tanzania, and the Gorwaa and Ihanzu lingua cultures located in north-central Tanzania. Zooming into the Tanzanian Rift and providing an overlay which maps language groups, it becomes immediately visible here that the Tanzanian Rift is an area of striking linguistic diversity, where languages from diverse phylogenetic groups are in contact and have been in contact for a long time. In addition to Southern Cushitic languages, of which Gorwaa is a constituent member, and Bantu languages, of which Ihanzu is a constituent member, there are also Eastern and Southern Nilotic languages, such as Datoga and Maasai, respectively. the language isolate Hadza, as well as Sandawe, which is either a language isolate or a distant member of the Khoi-Kwadi family of southwest Africa. It should also be at least mentioned that limiting Swahili to the coast is anachronistic, as the Swahili language, as well as the Swahili lingua culture, including Swahili riddles and riddling traditions, are now omnipresent across the whole of East Africa. With this briefest of introductions, I would like now to move on to our first comparison, essentially the rules of the game for riddling, that is, their discursive structure. In its simplest form, a single riddle exchange may be described in this way. Participant A issues a challenge and participant B accepts. Participant A will provide the description, what we might call the riddle itself, and participant B will provide the solution. Having answered correctly, participant B gains the right to pose the next riddle, and the process continues. If, however, participant B cannot correctly solve the riddle, they will eventually admit failure. Participant A will then request a payment for the riddle's solution, and this sets up an exchange between participants A and B, where participant B buys the riddle. When satisfied, speaker A accepts the payment offered and discloses the solution. The right to pose a new riddle remains with participant A, and they will continue with a new riddle. Focusing on the first two steps of the structure, the challenge and the acceptance of this challenge, we can see that in all three languages there is usually a word or short phrase which forms the challenge. In two of the cases, the word is either the word for riddle, so Swahili vitendawili, or a word related to the word for riddle, so Gorwaa sinik, and the word for riddle in Gorwaa being sinika. There is then a word uttered by participant B to accept the challenge. In Swahili, this is tega, to set a trap, and in Gorwaa, this is gerankai, meaning something like open it up. In Ihanzu, both the challenge formula and the acceptance formula are not semantically transparent. Returning to the discourse structure, we can now turn to the riddle description. It is important to note that for most riddles, the riddle description itself, here in bold on the screen, is not a question. Instead, riddles in all three of these traditions are more commonly short evocations, and the answer lies in identifying what is being evoked. Typically, riddles are short, pithy utterances, though sometimes, as the transcription of part of an Ihanzu riddling session on screen shows, the riddle may be couched in a larger vignette. Here, the riddle, again in bold, is situated in a larger hunting context with a question at the end. So it goes something like, I went hunting and we encountered a dik-dik. I had 2 clubs and I threw the first. I hit the dik-dik and it shat out flour. Tell me, answer me, what is it? And the answer, of course, being a baobab pod. A third section of discourse structure of riddles is the buying of a riddle's solution and the negotiation of its price. In the Swahili tradition, the typical currency with which riddles are bought is places, especially cities and towns. In the Gorwaa tradition, places also figure, but Datoga people and cattle are also common currency. Sometimes these cattle come along with rich descriptions of their appearance. In Ihanzu, places figure, but frequently also people, as well as items one might use to start a household. Hoes, axes, and similar equipment are popular. Another dimension along which we can compare these three traditions is that of the literary devices employed in the riddles themselves. It will not come as a surprise that metaphor is prevalent. In Swahili, we have the metaphor jiwe litoalo maji, and the answer being macho, so comparing a water-producing stone to the eyes. In Gorwaa, we have kererimo kwahut wa bara mahatimo, and the answer being tsifirang. So we have a blacksmith being compared to the tongue. A wonderfully subversive example is the Ihanzu Muzungu Ohongie, and the answer being Maeda, where a white man becomes snot. Across these three traditions, several metaphors are shared. The classic house with no door is an egg in both Swahili and Gorwaa, and in Ihanzu and Swahili, heavenly bodies are pastoral images. So in Swahili, we have the classic nyumba yangu haina mlango, my house has no door, and in Gorwaa, we have do utleh, tsufe do ikah, I build my house, but there is no entrance. And in Swahili, once again, we have fahadi wa ng'ombe na mbuzi wadogo machungani, small bulls and rams in pasture. And the Ihanzu riddle, idimila wa muga, they tend cattle, muga, and these answers being respectively an egg with the house with no door, and then the herding images are usually the moon and stars. A third and final literary device, robustly present in all three traditions, is the existence of semantic paradox in many of the riddles. In Swahili, we have the act of stabbing without arrows, so afuma hana mshale, he stabs but has no arrows, and the answer being nungu nungu, a porcupine. In Gorwaa, there's a particularly evocative description, so anadeem afi waang, Yikwae ipahiakang, I herd on the edge of the canyon, but my cattle do not fall, and the answer being kangi, or mist. So we have this evocative image of herding on the edge of a canyon, but inexplicably not falling. And in Ihanzu, we have nkete ludigi lulefu, shanga kutunga angangwi, I have a long rope, but it cannot even tie firewood, and the answer being nzila, a path. So we have this paradox of a rope that cannot be used to tie. In fact, that riddles are particularly rich sites of literary creativity has already been well argued in a talk given by my colleague Festo Masani on Gorwaa riddles and riddling. His argument is that if we examine solely the density of literary devices present in Gorwaa riddles, they can easily be seen as just as worthy of serious study as, say, the plays of William Shakespeare or the songs of Bob Dylan. The final comparison I'd like to make is the function of the riddle across these three lingua cultures. We can start very simply by saying riddling is for fun. The entertainment function of riddles across these three traditions is easy to see. Here is an example from the Kash cultural group telling Gorwaa riddles.
Sinik. Marako sinik. Wamur igur awa. Ah? Wamur igur awa.
Taratizi.
Ili aige. Kada tirgwadu.
Sinik. Kariga tata aludo.
Gasagusa.
Sinik.
But more than that, riddling is a deeply pedagogical genre. Not only is riddling an exercise in identifying metaphors and building vocabulary, but other types of learning are also present. Take, for example, the bargaining involved in buying the answer to a riddle when the solution cannot be found. In this recording, we can see that the exercise becomes one in local geography and, at the end, social relations. Here is a space for discussing what places and what people are good.
Nalengwa. Walengwa niki?
Kaku.
Mhekwa ege sare nukuiru nene niningire.
Opedi hands.
Ibe.
Ndo liyangalanga.
Inzira kutire nakukera kumwanso imetuka.
Longolako kumwanyomba.
Mwanyomba lunhundi.
Sigagwa pipe bag.
Hangipaka imate amunyu.
Kwala no kuphe muntu ko.
Mho muntu.
n'omusungu hamwe n'omugoha
Wehi.
nako Petro Magufuli
Wangharadia. Ngema kando wenene wewe longoleka tu.
akakumbala gwe andu ehi nako Petro Mamalani
Nakomba.
In fact, this is repeated in an interview with Ihanzu elder John Kipimo, who refers to stories and riddles being related to each other, exactly because their way of teaching what places are good and what places are bad.
Antawaiti oilaleki ni mahumo yantaiti aidha kole ndugu eye engwi ensokao aleza takire iti yantawaiti alinga paite panaiza ni panaibi
angenya itugwa
anaitu.
To conclude, then, this talk has gone some way to highlight how Swahili riddles and riddling and the riddles and riddling traditions of cultures further inland, in this case represented by the Gorwaa and Ihanzu lingua cultures, are not all that different from each other. In fact, they can each be seen as local instantiations of a much more widespread genre. Perhaps then the biggest difference between Swahili riddles and riddling and the traditions of the Rift is that in the Tanzanian context, the Swahili language enjoys a status of state use and protection to the point where we can see on the left a snippet from a government-developed language course, a part of which is dedicated to Swahili riddles. Gorwaa and Ihanzu, on the other hand, are fated to be part of the over 100 other native languages that are not accorded any official status in Tanzania. The ethnic community languages exist in a hostile political environment. Several regulations and policies restrict the domains of use for the ethnic community languages. They are not permitted in the schools, in the media, or in politics. While we may say then that Swahili riddles and riddling are positioned to remain a living and vital oral tradition into the future, for Gorwaa and Ihanzu to be the same will require considerable change in attitude and perspective. Before I finish, I would like to acknowledge Rahelilawi Festo Masani, the Rirota Cultural Group, the Kash Cultural Group, Samuel Isia, Emmanuel Marco, and John Kipimo for appearing in this talk. My fellow riftologists include Alice Mitchell, Martin Mouse, Richard Griscom, Crispina Alphonse, Michael Karani, Ana Chiara Raia, Ruthie Venske, Alina Witzlach, Festo Masani, Roland Kiesling, Sarah Petrolino, and Bonnie Sands. Thank you, and here are my references.